in the Ross School of Business in the Management and Organizations Department, and self-defined member of the Center for Positive Organizational Scholarship, or Positive Organizations. And we're so delighted to have you here, really delighted to have you here, and especially to hear one of my favorite people and an extraordinary scholar and presenter. I'll introduce her in a few minutes. What we'd like to do, though, is introduce, first of all, with a short video, the Center for Positive Organizations, which is the sponsoring organization for this event. So Ryan is the magician, and we'll watch this first.
Moments of greatness are all around us. Do you see them? It's when you're at your best. It's when your team or organization is at its best. Here at the Center for Positive Organizations, we seek to understand this greatness, to help you and your organization be at your best more often. Greatness is seen in the high-performing, ethical, and generous leadership found at all levels of an organization. It can be found in your workplace relationships and a career filled with purpose, meaning, and compassion. It's seen in resilient teams who buck the status quo to make a culture change. It's in organizations that make a positive difference in the world. Hundreds of researchers from around the world study these phenomena in a field of science founded here at the University of Michigan. And to this day, we remain the movement's central catalytic hub. We share this knowledge in inspiring and practical ways through innovative learning programs, events, resources, and organizational partnerships. In our diverse co-learning community of scholars, educators, students, and leaders, we give opportunities for individuals and organizations to find and grow greatness. Together, we are building a new breed of organization, the positive organization.
Thank you, Ryan. So the executive director of the Center for Positive Organizations is Chris White, who has a short announcement for us. Thanks, Chris.
Hi, everyone. I've met some of you in person, others I haven't. This is just a short and, I'll say it up front, a non-partisan announcement. But the Center for Positive Organizations would be remiss if we didn't mobilize some of our resources right now, given some of the fear that people are experiencing in our societies, in our communities, and some of the challenges that people are facing during what is for some people a very, very difficult time. And those resources take the form of the wisdom and the research that have been generated through hundreds of researchers over a decade plus into how do you lead in trying times? How do you lead with compassion? How do you lead in an inclusive way? How do you help people make sense of the confusing times around us? And so we are curating that material to share publicly right now. Some of it already exists, some will be new content. And we will be sharing it and inviting researchers, leaders, and students to share what they're finding to be useful in building better, more positive organizations and communities during what is, some people, a very difficult time. And so we invite you to share in that project as well, to create something that we can share with the world. So, thank you.
So it is our tradition at the beginning of each of these events to have you create in 1 minute, 60 seconds, a high-quality connection, especially with someone whom you do not know or with whom you're not familiar. So I will time you. I have a watch or a clock, and you get 60 seconds, and then you're encouraged to find someone that you don't know And you got 1 minute to create a high-quality connection. Ready, set, go.
Hi. I'm such a fan of your work.
Thank you. Nice to meet you. Yeah, great. Hi, I'm Carol.
Hi, Carol.
Good to meet you.
Renee Dario.
Renee, good to meet you.
Nice to meet you. How are you?
I'm good. This is a nice way to start. It's kind of like being in an Episcopal church service. Yeah. Really? Really? What do you do?
I study how to treat purposeful physical activity, how to help people change their mindset around dangers of exercise.
Yeah.
And also helps them learn how to sustain it over time.
Yeah.
I learned about
Good for you.
from Abby Stewart.
Oh, really?
Yes, he's one of my
Oh my gosh. Wow, that's a while ago. Yeah.
So, as you have seen up here on these slides, there are several people whom we need to thank. Great big thank you to Tom Jones and Diane, his wife, who is moving her mother at the moment into a care facility, what is it, something, home
Yeah, in Florida.
in Florida, who's 93, 92, in her 90s. Big trauma always to move from an independent living into a home. But anyway, thanks, Paul, who's been sponsoring this for a lot of years. In addition to that, the Michigan, now it's called Learning and Professional Development Center, used to be called Executive Education Center, who's also sponsoring, as well as the Sanger Leadership Center here, as well as the Tauber Institute here, as well as the Zell-Lori Center for Entrepreneurship here. So wonderful cross-disciplinary support and involvement, in addition to Paul and Diane. So now let me introduce Carol. I think it was a year ago, Carol, and I just am embarrassed that I don't remember the title, but Carol was selected as the distinguished scholar, the award winner, the grand poobah in the entire field of health, positive health research by the International Positive Psychology Association. And that's sort of typical of her stature in the field and the contribution she's made. Paul mentioned in a little meeting prior that he would like to read a book that she's written. And Carol's most of Carol's professional contributions have been academic journal articles. But if you just stack those journal articles up, you have a pretty big book. She's done a lot of work. She's currently the director of the Center for Aging, is that what it's called?
Institute on Aging, yeah.
Institute on Aging, doing research on well-being, on resilience, on positive health, but an extraordinary person, human being. The most impact that I've personally had is, by her work, is that she created probably the world's best known, most used instrument to measure well-being. Autonomy, environmental mastery, personal growth, positive relations, purpose in life, self-acceptance, those 6 dimensions. And when you want to measure well-being almost any place, those multi-dimensions are in part, I guess they're almost universally used by folks. So big impact across lots of disciplines. And today, everybody who's met Carol has said, oh man, what a wonderful visit we had with her. Even though she's such a wonderful scholar, she's really talked in a way that's been helpful to students, to colleagues, faculty. So we are so glad you're here.
Thank you.
And the other thing is, she's at the University of Wisconsin.
Thank you.
My first job out of graduate school was at the University of Wisconsin, and my blood is finally thinner as a result of moving out of that cold climate.
Thank you.
Glad you're
Thank
here.
you. Thank you. Thank you. Mics are on. I'm delighted to be here. I have had wonderful interactions with people from the beginning of the day until now, and to actually be at the Center for Positive Organizations is really a growth experience for me, because I've done a lot of research, but not much of my research has really brought the components of well-being that I study into the workplace or organizations. So this is an important opportunity for me. And so I come with this weird title. I realized using the word eudaimonia in my title was a bit risky. Like people would say, who is this woman? And why can't she write a title that somebody can get? Eudaimonia is a word people can't spell or say, but I want to take you into the meaning of eudaimonia, which I think is a profoundly beautiful set of ideas, and I think it's fundamentally important if we are trying to formulate the positive side of the human experience. So I always begin my talks with a kind of plan to give you some roadmap for what I hope to cover. So I will, of course, start with trying to explain to you what do I think eudaimonic, what is the idea of eudaimonia, what does it actually mean? And that requires that we go back to the ancient Greeks. It was Aristotle who wrote about eudaimonia, and other ancient Greeks wrote about hedonia. So we'll look at that, and then I'm going to, in kind of a fast-paced way, breeze you through a lot of current research on eudaimonia. Much of it in my area of inquiry has been focused on how does eudaimonia change as people age across the life course. And I'm also very interested in how does eudaimonia matter for health, digging into the mechanisms, the physiological mechanisms, what's going on in the brain. But because I'm here at the Center for Positive Organizations, I use this talk to basically push myself to think more about eudaimonia and the workplace. And I'm going to say a little bit about eudaimonic research in the MIDUS study. MIDUS is mentioned here several times. That stands for midlife in the US. It's a major national longitudinal study of Americans. It now includes over 12,000 Americans, many of whom have been studied for more than 2 decades. And that's the empirical database from which I'll be speaking in reporting a lot of findings. But I will also, I indicate MIDUS Plus in several areas. There are other studies that are also investigating eudaimonia. And I will summarize some of those effects. In MIDUS, it turns out one of the areas of research that I think is novel and important and interesting is about the work-family interface. I don't do that work, but I'm very interested in that work, and I'm going to say a little bit about that. And then I'm going to say some things that push me to think more about how does this world of eudaimonia that I've invested my career in relate to positive organizational scholarship of the sort that's being done here. And that leads me to some reflections about the ideal job, the ideal organizational environment. In studying the upside of the human experience, I think it's always really important for us to formulate our ideals. We perhaps don't achieve them, but if we don't have the ideals, we don't really even know what we're reaching for. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning of my academic career. I published a paper back in 1989 called Happiness is Everything, or Is It? Explorations on the Meaning of Psychological Well-Being. And at that time, this was well before the positive psychology movement was being discussed anywhere. But people were studying what was called successful aging. And successful aging at that time was defined as having some happiness, having some life satisfaction. But if you really scratch beneath the surface and you tried to figure out, well, why did they come up with life satisfaction or even happiness, there was nothing there. And as an undergraduate, I had been really taken with a lot of existential psychology, humanistic psychology, developmental psychology. So you can see these people below the 6 components of well-being that I ultimately formulated. Those people were writing about the upside of the human experience in really rich and interesting ways, but none of those ideas were making their way into the empirical arena. And the reason that wasn't happening is because there were no assessment tools. Nobody had figured out how do we translate these wonderful ideas about well-being into components of well-being that we can actually quantify and empirically measure. And I'm going to come back to eudaimonia after I first show you some imagery for the 6 components of well-being that became my model. And that basically means these 6 components represent the points of convergence in all of this prior literature that I was reading. I was weaving it together to define these 6 components of well-being, and the hand symbolizes reaching for something new. So, purpose in life, we don't get any more existential than thinking about the purpose and meaning in our lives. These images were sent to me one year by my dear friend Dov Shmotkin, who's a clinical psychologist at the University of Tel Aviv, and he thought I needed some pictures for my 6 components. So this is the painting Raphael's School of Athens, which I think is wonderful imagery for capturing the idea of leading a life that has meaning and purpose and direction. This was the image he sent for personal growth, making the most of your talents and capacities as you move through life, including as you deal with biological aging. Personal growth doesn't stop, even though your body may be slowing or your mind may be slowing. Personal growth is a kind of opportunity that exists for us every day of our lives. Self-acceptance, I love this imagery. It's so much deeper and richer than self-esteem, which has been in the psychological vernacular for a very long time. But self-acceptance, drawing on the Jungian idea of the shadow, self-acceptance is about recognizing both your strengths and your weaknesses and knowing how to work with them effectively. Autonomy is a very Western conception of well-being. I think it's best distilled as marching to your own drummer, feeling that you can make choices for yourself and your life that may go against conventional wisdom. And environmental mastery, managing your external world. It's kind of like self-control, but it has more of an emphasis, like sense of control, but it has more of an emphasis on person-environment fit. Which is very important when we think about the workplace and environmental mastery. Finding contexts and environments that really are suited to you and your capacities. Positive relations with others is no question, the most universally endorsed aspect of what it means to be well and functioning optimally as a human being. So you couldn't have a conception of human well-being without really getting seriously into the quality of your ties to others. Okay, but none of that had anything to do with Aristotle. And the fact is, I didn't start out by reading Aristotle. You know, my own lifelong learning took me to Aristotle some years after reading that prior literature. And the Nicomachean Ethics is an amazing book when you consider that it was written over 2,000 years ago. But he starts out with the really big question: what is the highest of all human goods? And he answered that it was eudaimonia. This is where we get the word eudaimonia, which is translated as activity of the soul in accord with virtue. And then he pushes himself. That book is totally a journey of Aristotle pushing himself to answer these really big-time questions without relying on dogma or any other kind of pronounced truths. He's really digging his way through it. He then asks himself, what is the highest virtue? And his answer is that it is achieving the best that is within us. And that, I think, is the essence of eudaimonia. It requires knowing yourself, and it requires a commitment and an effort to achieve the best that is within yourself. Bertrand Russell wrote about the conquest of happiness. Happiness isn't just about having ripened fruit dropping easily into our mouths. It's about striving. It's about proactive becoming. And I think those are really key in the Aristotelian formulation. Other ancient Greeks wrote about hedonia. I mean, the Greeks were into well-being in a big way. But those who wrote about hedonia were emphasizing more pleasure, happiness, contentment. And I just think it's a really interesting observation that long ago there were these two kinds of well-being, which are now very prominent in our contemporary research on well-being. And they're both important. I'm not the anti-hedonia woman. I work hard to get my fair share of eudaimonia. But I think the more neglected aspect of well-being, particularly in this culture, is the eudaimonic aspects. This is just to point out, for those of you who are interested in eudaimonia, there's a new handbook on eudaimonic well-being. I think it's worth looking at. I used my chapter in the handbook to try to articulate why do I think these ideas are so beautiful. And I do think they're incredibly beautiful ideas about articulating the upside of the human experience and reaching for the best that is within us. So to my amazement, to my utter amazement, because I was kind of working in a field that was not populated by other people when I started in this pursuit, there are now over 500 publications using these scales of well-being, which have been translated into more than 30 languages. They caught on. They caught on in some big way. And this is a review article where I summarize some of the main themes in this prior work. First, I would just underscore, why has it caught on in such a big way? This is about soft, squishy, phenomenological, subjective experience, but it's something that people are really interested in. And I believe that there's so much interest in these scales because they capture what it means to be proactive and to make meaning and to try to achieve the best that is within us. But the components that, the themes basically that I summarized in this article, lots of people have focused on the psychometric properties. Do the scales really add up to a meaningful six-factor structure? That's been studied a lot. Many people have tracked how these things change as people age across the life course. There's a lot of linking of these components of well-being to personality traits. Family life has been linked to these things, and work and volunteer commitments. I'll say a little bit about that. I've been especially interested in linking these components of well-being to health and biomarkers. And at the end of this article, I summarize a lot of the current work on interventions to promote well-being. Much of my work has been done in the context of MIDUS, which stands for Midlife in the US. This is a brochure you would find on our website. I just want to underscore that this was a study from the beginning that was focused on promoting positive health and resilience. The content of the study is huge. It's not just about my little corner of well-being. That is in the study, but there's so much more in the study than that. It's multidisciplinary. We have epidemiologists, demographers, psychoneuroimmunologists, all kinds of biomedical people. Many varieties of psychology are embedded in this study. And it's publicly available, and it's soaring. It's really captivated the interest of the scientific community. We have close to 800 publications from the study. The data are obviously publicly available. This is the website. This is a table you would find if you go onto the website and you click on publications. You see all of these different areas in which publications have been generated. So there are over 150 publications just on well-being. And we have good measures of hedonic well-being, eudaimonic well-being, daily life well-being. There are many other topics that have been studied as well, and I'll come back to the occupation and employment and work and family categories. But now I want to give you a very quick glimpse of some of the empirical findings. And I apologize for going through this in a kind of breezy way. I'm happy to share the slides with anybody or the papers, whatever, but I want to make sure we have some time to really dig into the interface between eudaimonia and the positive organizational structure. So a first study from the MIDUS baseline data. This was one of the first studies to actually, it was the first study based on population level data that had measures of both hedonia and eudaimonia. And one of the things we had to demonstrate that was really important is that they are, of course, they're related to each other because they're both about well-being, but they are also distinct. And that's really important to demonstrate empirically, to demonstrate it in terms of the best fitting model, to demonstrate it in terms of what their correlates are. So this was an answer to those who would basically say, why do we have to ask so many questions about well-being if we really want to capture what it is? Why can't we just ask people 3 questions? Isn't that enough? And this is basically saying, no, it's not enough because it's multidimensional. There are many components to it. And as it turns out, these distinctions have become even more important as we move toward biology and even gene expression. Okay, so here are some of the items that capture purpose in life and personal growth. But one of the things that we have learned with these new measures, and I'm just going to zero in on purpose in life and personal growth here because they were just not present in the scientific arena prior to these scales, is there's evidence of vulnerability with aging. So this was baseline cross-sectional data from the MIDUS baseline study, just comparing average scores on the components of well-being as a function of age. So you look at the fuchsia line and the green line, purpose and personal growth, and you see these downward trajectories with age for women. You see the same thing for men. I'm not talking about the other components here. Subsequent longitudinal study from 3 different data sets. The MIDUS National Study, the National Survey of Families and Households, and the Wisconsin Longitudinal Study. Those studies have all documented that on average there is decline in purpose in life and personal growth as people age, which is cause for concern, right? I mean, I wasn't pleased to actually learn that from the data. If we ask ourselves, why is this happening on average? Sociologists like Matilda White Riley would have argued, as she did in her career, that it reflects what she called the structural lag problem, which is that our social institutions lag behind the added years of life that people now experience. So people are living longer, but society hasn't kept up in terms of providing older people with opportunities for meaningful engagement and continued development. And I would underscore for this crowd that some of that decline in purpose in life and personal growth probably reflects transitions out of work roles. But let me underscore the bottom of this slide. Those are average effects. And the big story about aging is variability. That yes, you can chart what the average looks like, but the variability gets even greater as people age, which means there are some older people who in fact have high levels of purposeful engagement and are continuing to grow and learn. And that's where the story gets really interesting because those people are reaping remarkable health benefits. So this is where I move into some more recent studies that are connecting purpose in life to morbidity and mortality, regulation of different physiological systems, what's going on in the brain, and preventive health behaviors. So a first study from the Memory and Aging Project run out of Rush University in Chicago. This is based on a 6-year community-based epidemiological study, showed that older people with higher levels of purpose in life at baseline lived longer. They had extended longevity, and this is well-done epidemiology that controls for all kinds of confounds. That same study also showed, because it was about cognitive aging, showed that those with higher purpose in life were at reduced risk for Alzheimer's disease and cognitive impairment. And in the same study, they get people to donate their brains after they die, so that after their deaths, they can score their brains for degree of pathology in the brain. And they can then look at how much pathology there was in the brain and how was the person functioning when they were still alive, cognitively. So on the vertical axis in both of those graphs, you have cognitive capacity while they're still alive. And on the x-axis, you have the degree of plaques and tangles, indicators of brain pathology. And the two lines in each of the graphs are basically showing that even among those who have high levels of organic pathology in the brain, there is a notable difference in cognitive functioning while they're still alive as a function of purpose in life, which implies some sort of compensatory mechanisms that need to be studied and understood, but this is pretty compelling stuff. Purpose in life, this is a MIDUS finding that also shows that purpose in life predicts extended life across adulthood. And this just came out this year. It's a meta-analysis of over 136,000 people in 10 prospective studies. Higher purpose in life, including in studies in Japan, where there's something called ikigai, which is what makes life worth living. These studies show that high purpose in life predicts extended longevity and reduced risk of cardiovascular events. So there's something pretty important going on here. Then let me praise a graduate of the University of Michigan, Eric Kim, from the psych department here. He worked with Victor Strecker, among other people, and he was just a go-getter of a graduate student who, using the health and retirement study, which is run out of Michigan, his longitudinal aging study, he basically used the purpose in life scale, which was from my battery, to show that purpose in life in this longitudinal aging study predict reduced risk of myocardial infarction among adults with coronary heart disease. It predicts reduced risk of stroke. And I think a really important finding from Eric Kim is to start to fill in mechanisms at the level of behaviors, health behaviors. So the last publication basically showed that purpose in life predicts better preventive health behaviors. People who have higher levels of purpose in life are more likely to get cholesterol tests, cancer screenings, flu shots, that sort of thing. In MIDUS, we are linking these measures to physiological systems. So there's something called allostatic load, which is a summary index of wear and tear across different physiological systems in the body. And this publication basically showed that purpose in life predicts lower levels of allostatic load, again, after adjusting for a variety of confounds. And then I'm very interested in, because I think it's especially in the present era, I am very interested in the problem of inequality in this country, which is driving a lot, I think, that's going on in the political arena. And lots of people are studying health inequalities in this country. So this is a study that showed that if you have lower educational status in this country, you have elevated levels on average of interleukin-6. And I'll show you in a next slide what that means. It's involved in the etiological pathway to numerous disease endpoints. But The really cool part of this study is that high eudaimonic well-being is protective among those with low educational status. That is, they don't show the same elevated levels of interleukin-6 as their same education counterparts. So the bar chart here is first showing you elevated levels of interleukin-6, which is an inflammatory marker that is involved in numerous diseases. I mean, the scope here is pretty amazing. Cardiovascular disease, cancer, rheumatological diseases, osteoporosis, Alzheimer's. So we first show this gradient, which was not news. That had already been documented in other studies, but it's moderated by levels of psychological well-being. And that's what all of these graphs show, is that among those with only a high school education, having higher levels of multiple aspects of well-being reduced their risk of having elevated interleukin-6. Okay, eudaimonia and the brain. Why does this matter? Why should we care? If we really want to assemble compelling scientific evidence that eudaimonia is important for promoting good health and well-being, we need to know how it works. We need to know how it works in the brain and in the physiology, and that's a big part of what we're trying to do in the MIDUS study. So this is work that comes out of Richie Davidson's lab at the University of Wisconsin. He studies emotion regulation, or what he calls affective neuroscience. And so this is a publication that basically shows those with higher levels of purpose in life show better emotion regulation after negative provocation in the lab. And then this is a really wonderful publication. Both of these are MIDUS findings. This is about eudaimonia and reward circuitry in the brain. A lot of emotion regulation focuses on the amygdala, which is not about reward circuitry, but there are other centers of the brain that we can bring in when we're studying eudaimonic well-being. And in this study, those connections between eudaimonia and reward circuitry were also linked with people's levels of salivary cortisol, a stress hormone measured 4 times a day over the course of 4 days. So a first thing we see here, this is not just purpose in life, this is the composite of all of the eudaimonic scales. So on the vertical axis, you have psychological well-being. On the x-axis, you have sustained, so this is a neuroimaging study. So this is about people who show sustained engagement of the ventral striatum area, which is a reward circuitry area when they're looking at positive stimuli. So you show them positive stimuli, and people differ in how long the activation is in the area of reward circuitry. So those who, I mean, this is milliseconds, okay? But those who are hanging on to this positive stimuli in the brain for a longer period of time are also those who report higher levels of eudaimonic well-being overall. And those who show this sustained activation of the ventral striatum also show better hormonal profiles over the course of the day, reduced salivary cortisol over the course of the day, whether you measure it in terms of area under the curve or you measure it in terms of the 4 time points across the course of the day. So this is taking us in, I think, really important territory to dig into the underlying mechanisms that are connecting this subjective phenomenological stuff to what's going on in the brain and in the physiology. Okay, so now we're at the part this is new territory for me. Although I will show you, there are a lot of publications in MIDUS linking occupational life and the workplace to various things. Very little of the work has been about eudaimonia. Even though the measures are there, that's really not what people have studied. So you'll see that under occupation and employment, we have 85 publications, and then under work and family, we have 35 publications. So this is just an illustrative list of some of what you would see on the website if you click on occupation and employment. So some folks from Michigan have linked job insecurity to workers' health, or unfairness at work to blood pressure, or night shift work to sleep quality and obesity, or the prevalence and correlates of discrimination in the workplace. So this kind of captures in some ways the usual emphasis on the negative in the workplace and its linkage to compromising health. But we have in MIDUS this interest in the work-family interface that was initiated way back when the study was being conceived. It was originally funded by the MacArthur Foundation because I think it was so out there in terms of multidisciplinary scope that the NIH would never have touched it at the beginning. So originally it was funded by the MacArthur Foundation. And then we subsequently got funding, but you know, Alice Rossi was a wonderful sociologist involved in the original study. She had a big interest in work-family interface, as did other people, but we got into these ideas of how does work life spill over into family life? How does family life spill over into work life? There can be positive kinds of spillover where one enriches the other, and there can be negative kinds of spillover where conflict at work means you come home and you don't just kick the dog, you scream at your kids. And so we have people who have really gone after this in MIDUS. These are just to give you a flavor of how does work-family spillover get operationalized. So there's some negative items at the top. Work stress at home, or stress at work makes you irritable at home. Or on the positive side, the things you do at work help you deal with personal and practical issues at home. So there's a series of items like this. That's going from work to family. And then this is going from family to work. And again, you can formulate this both in terms of negative effects, where stress at home is making it difficult for you to concentrate and focus when you're at work, or what's going on at home might actually make you more effective and more productive at work. So a first publication from Joe Grivach and Nadine Marks basically tried to link those components of work-family spillover to what they called work ecology, number of hours worked, stress on the job, decision latitude, or family ecology. And a lot of findings have been built around what's happening in the workplace and how does it relate to work-family spillover and health. And these papers can be reviewed on the MIDUS website if you're interested in them. Positive work-to-family spillover, not surprisingly, predicts better mental and physical health. Family-to-work facilitation, that's the positive side again, offsets the deleterious effects of work-family conflict. Not surprisingly, work pressure and family disagreements predicts problem drinking. But if you have positive spillover from family to work, it reduces the odds of drinking. Jobs with more autonomy, variety, substantive complexity predict higher levels of work-family facilitation. Work-family conflict and family-to-work enrichment are particularly salient for well-being measured in these kinds of ways. So this is some of what goes on in MIDUS. Debbie Carr is a sociologist really interested in cohort effects, which are really important and interesting to study. So this is where she looks at how this work-family thing plays out differently by different cohorts of adults in America. So younger couples are dealing with work-family issues in different ways than probably their parents or their grandparents' generation. Okay, what about beyond MIDUS? Okay, so this is where I come to, I don't know nearly enough about what goes on here, but I'm pleased to begin learning some about it through this positive organizational scholarship and this emphasis on optimal organizations that promote these qualities, these wonderful positive qualities, resilient employees, and enhance performance, one hopes. And I just, I was just surfing the net, and there's just interesting stuff out there. A new publication from some folks at the University of Melbourne in Australia have this model of work happiness, and it's a big, complicated model, and I'm not here to explain the model. But and there's kind of how the outside in, how things from work ultimately make their way into employee work happiness, or how individual factors make their way through. So there's a lot of actually positive stuff in this figure. A lot of positive stuff in this figure in terms of the culture at work, trust, integrity, optimism, compassion at the individual level, hope, optimism, self-efficacy, ultimately ending up in these things out here. Job satisfaction, work engagement. And I'm asking, where is eudaimonia? Where is eudaimonia? That is my big question. I think it's not there. It's not there in those models. And it's pushing me, I think, to try to articulate what do I mean when I say that. And I would just note, going back to this review that I did in 2014, there were a few articles that actually did link the workplace to components of eudaimonia, kind of in both directions, a kind of bi-direct, like if you fall short of your career goals, you might not be surprised to know that it predicts lower purpose in life and higher depressive symptoms. Alternatively, if you have higher levels of purpose in life and personal growth, you may show stronger career commitments. So some people were starting to build these bridges to these components of eudaimonic well-being and the workplace. I just threw this book up because I'm coming back to Aristotle. I'm making my way back to Aristotle. And this is a really interesting book about virtue in the workplace. It's, for the most part, I don't think it's written by people in occupational psychology or psychology for that matter. But it is about bringing virtue ethics into the workplace. So there's three kinds of ethics. If you're an expert in ethics, there's Kantian deontological ethics, let's live by rules that we all are required to follow. There's utilitarian ethics that says we should be promoting the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. And then there's Aristotle. Aristotle's virtue ethics is really about promoting virtue and the best that is within us. And all of those components of ethics that are in his Nicomachean Ethics. So this is a really interesting book that is trying to take those ideas of virtue into many different forms of the workplace. So coming back to the reflections part, if Aristotle was right, that the highest virtue is achieving the best within us, then I think positive organizations and ideal jobs should be about nurturing the realization of personal talents and capacities, about having opportunities for personal growth and becoming, and certainly opportunities for purposeful, meaningful engagement. And so we can look at this list and we can say, oh, come on, let's get real, that is so hopelessly idealized. What kind of workplace could ever be characterized as offering these things? And this is where it gets, I think, really tricky, to remind ourselves that the formulation of some of these positive ideals came out of some of the most abject negative conditions imaginable. Okay, so who is the ultimate thinker on the life-sustaining value of purpose in life? It's Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who spent 3 years in Nazi concentration camps. And this book, which I recommend that everybody read, I've read it multiple times myself, it's an astonishing work about achieving a kind of spiritual freedom in a context in which life could not be more horrible. So he could not control what was happening to him. But his big insight was what he could control was his reaction to it. And he chose to find meaning and purpose in it by going back into his past life, but also by envisioning a future. So what I would say, even if you're in the crappiest job in the world, you have an opportunity to actually find meaning in, that's your job, that's your existential task, to find some meaning, even if at certain points, and I say this to young people, I mean, during periods of economic recession, the job market is not what you would like it to be. You may have to live with limited limited opportunities to realize your larger aspirations initially, but you need to actually believe in your aspirations, and you need to actually make meaning when it comes to doing the negative stuff. And I did a lot of really crappy jobs early in my life. I mean, working my way through college and university, I put up with a lot of crappy jobs. But those jobs taught me a great deal about other people in crappy jobs and compassion for other people in those crappy jobs and ways in which they still lead lives that are meaningful and purposeful. So, my recap. I hope I've convinced you that eudaimonia is part of a well-lived life. I hope I've convinced you that eudaimonia matters for health, and that I think I don't need to convince you that the work lives that we inhabit are critical contexts for enacting eudaimonia, which for me would underscore the importance of self-realization and personal growth in the workplace. There's much to be done on that front, and I would just close with these wonderful lines from John Stuart Mill. Really interesting guy. I had a wonderful discussion with Paul about his autobiography today. We could rephrase what he said here, but he's basically saying, happiness, and he's talking initially about hedonic happiness. Hedonic happiness is a byproduct of other more noble deeds, which I would say is about eudaimonia. I think it was a brilliant insight that John Stuart Mill had, in that we all need to be on the road to pursuing these more noble ideals. And that may give us some happiness as a byproduct. It may also give us some stress and conflict as a byproduct. But what he's really advancing here is the importance of focusing on something other than just your own hedonic happiness. Thank you.
So, thank you. The Master of Ceremonies over there. So I know some of you have to leave right away, but is there a burning question or two that we can take 5 minutes to talk about? And then Jandy over here, who's doing her doctoral dissertation on purpose and the non-monetary benefits of college education, primarily purpose.